Cool. Nice clear
So
message.
welcome, welcome to the call, folks. Can I say a big thank you to Simon and Kate for volunteering to do this session today. It came out of a very casual conversation that Kate and I were having on LinkedIn, and especially about all the awards that Simon and Kate and the Studio 24 folk have won for their work on the W3C website, which must have been a bit daunting, considering it's one of the longest running websites in the world and was started by Tim Berners-Lee. I mean, I think I'd have run away in fright. But you've won lots of different awards. So is it Gaadys? Is
Yeah,
that
so
how you
the
pronounce it?
Gaadys is it's organised by the Global Accessibility Day Foundation. So
Mm-hmm.
that's like I think once a year they literally have like a 24-hour online conference all about accessibility, completely free. And yeah, they've started some awards up, which is really cool. So they awarded, I think it was 3 prizes, wasn't it? And we won one of them for the redesign of a W3C website, which is lovely to receive, quite frankly.
Yeah,
And my
and
colleague Emma was actually in San Francisco last week, I think it was, accepting the award, which is lovely.
yeah, that's great. And then there were the W3 awards themselves.
Yeah, so W3, just another award system, and that's Kate would have to remind me exactly what the award was called for that one. Best
Um,
practices, wasn't it?
yeah, it was website
Yeah,
best practices.
that's right. Yeah, and I think we got a kind of like a bronze award in the BIMA, which is like a digital agency group, recently as well, which I think was
Yeah,
announced earlier this week, which is
yeah.
really nice. But yeah, that was a
Well,
big project, the W3C redesign, and it was a bit daunting, to be honest with
yeah.
you. And we started it as the pandemic started as well in March
Mm,
2020, which is a
yeah,
bit mad. But yeah, we're really proud of the results. We've
yeah.
always cared about accessibility, so it's lovely to design something like this for the people
Mm.
who make the standards.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And what came out of that was this program called Amplify that you're now
Yeah,
using to help other web designers make things more accessible as well, and really spreading the word and doing all the open source stuff that we all love. So thank you so much for doing that. It's great. So Simon, over to you. Where would you like to start with this?
yeah. Well, you sent some questions, so I can kind of read them out and just talk a bit about some of them because I touch on different aspects of accessibility. And I can reference the Amplify project, and obviously, if there's any questions about that afterwards, happy to answer any. I mean, for the W3C redesign, we created a design system, which is at designsystem.w3.org, and that was using because as an agency, we like many people, we kind of have our own way of starting HTML and CSS, and that's what fed into the W3C website project. But then it had loads of accessibility testing on top of it, and there were people within W3C volunteers who, as a blind person who was able to test the site with us and give us some valuable feedback. We understood how they browsed the site, which is quite illuminating because you don't realize things like, you hear about people having to have correct alt text for images, but I think she explained a bit more how when she navigates pages, she'll skip through all the headings on a page, which is why having correct headings is really important because they become like navigation points almost for people. So they have to make sense and they have to kind of be, semantically H1, H2, H3 in order, which is just content. And that's the responsibility of clients who manage websites as much as it is people making them. And then after the W3C project finished, we basically created Amplify, which was kind of the learnings we took from a W3C project into essentially our starter kit, is probably the best way to call it. And it's open source, so anyone's able to use it. We probably could do some work on making it a little easier for people to use. It'd be interesting to hear if anyone's has used it or has any questions or gets confused about anything, because we probably could make the new user bit a bit easier for people. But it's essentially a lot of HTML and CSS patterns, which are all accessible, like ways to build like just the layout of a page, whether it's multiple columns or specific bits of a page, such as pagination, for example, or forms. And a lot of the stuff we've got, we're learning from other people. So people like the Gov UK design system you might have heard of, has lots of amazing user research behind it. And there are things in the forms, for example, that we just took directly from there because they're best practice, basically. And so we try and write documentation and links to where we learn things. So if there's a project like another one that we took ideas from, we try and link to it from Amplify. So it's easy for you to go back and kind of find like where we learned the stuff from, and we, can find out in more depth really. But yeah, your first question was what are the best steps to retrofit accessibility into a site? Because not everyone has the insight to build an accessible site in the first place. Lots of these can be smaller businesses who can't afford a complete site overhaul, but what can be done to improve access to existing content? cheap, quick fixes and best practice to action whilst bigger long-term plans are developed. So that's quite common. I mean, we have sites obviously that are old and aren't fully accessible, and we end up fixing them our own sites. And obviously we strive to make new things more accessible, of course. And it depends how complicated the site is a little bit. If you've got really, really complicated systems, it can be quite difficult to retrofit stuff, but most websites are a bit simpler. I mean, there's a few resources I was going to share. I don't know whether you want me to share my screen. Want to just show some of these or share links?
Okay. Let me just do the screen sharing thing. There you go.
Yes. I have to there's the button. Sorry. Switching between different systems, remembering. Da, da, da. I think this is just going to share Firefox, I hope.
There you go.
Looks like it has. Can you see that okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, w3.org, the Web Accessibility Initiative, is probably one of the best places to go to learn about all of this stuff. There's a lot of content on the website, though, and some of it can be a bit overwhelming, especially the specs themselves. I mean, while they're useful as reference points, they're not a very good place to start, I don't think, with accessibility, because there's just so much information. Some of it's quite technical. They do publish quite a lot of guidance, though, which is really super helpful. And there's other tools you can use as well, which I'll show you. But just do that. So this is a list of essentially answering my question from the Web Accessibility Initiative, like what can you do to review a website as like an initial kind of first steps effectively. And they have basically a bunch of like basic things to check through. You're probably familiar with some of these, like alt text and images, headings I mentioned earlier, obviously. And some of them, like contrast, which is one of the biggest problems on the web as far as accessibility goes. I think it's pretty much the number one issue with accessibility across the web, people not having the right contrast. And I'll show you that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But this basically gives you a bunch of instructions on how to kind of test for these things, what to do. It's quite a nice introduction article. So it's one place to start anywhere as far as like trying to learn about this stuff goes. There are a lot of guidelines in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, which actually were updated about a month ago. So I don't know if you're aware that for a very long time it was WCAG version 2.1, and that's what's referred to in most of the laws that exist around accessibility. 2.2 was published in October, I think after something like 2.5 years of discussing it. And there's not many changes, but there's a few, and just so you're aware, it has things like making it's called accessible authentication, which is when you log into a website. So things like trying not to rely on captchas, which you might see on websites where you have to kind of solve complex puzzles or other things. You need kind of accessible versions of that. But the Web Aim Million, I don't know if anyone heard about this at all. So it's a kind of project that's been going for quite a while now. And WebAIM are an accessibility organization, and they do an audit of the top million homepages, which is really useful because it shows how many problems there are across the web and where the common problems are. And if you do nothing else, it's quite nice to focus on the common problems, because if you fix these on your websites, then you'll be better than the top million homepages probably, or at least a very large significant proportion of them. Because something like, I think it's like 92% or something have most of the kind of these big common errors. I'm just scrolling down the page a bit just to try and get to the summary bit where it says the top 6 issues. Here we go. So yeah, while there are lots of guidelines there, these are the ones that most commonly crop up. Obviously, WebAIM has to use an automated testing tool to detect this. So there are some things that are impossible to test with automated testing. People say if you use an automated tool to test for accessibility, it's going to catch around 30% of accessibility guidelines. It can be a bit more than that, but you're never going to fix all accessibility problems by just using an automated tool. Unfortunately, you have to kind of have a human look at it. And if you can get actual real people to test stuff, that's definitely the best way to do it. But low contrast, as I say, is the highest one. So something like 85% or so of all these million homepages that have been tested fail on contrast. So the classic stuff is when you have essentially text that doesn't have a high enough contrast with its background, so it becomes difficult to read. And it might be because the design's not brilliant, and maybe if you used, you know, lovely pastel colors, the text color is a little bit not quite clear enough. And sometimes it's because you have images behind text. That's a really common one. I think I saw that on a university site very recently, actually. And no, actually, it was a Royal Family website. That was it. When they were in the news, I looked at their website on my mobile phone, and while it looks fine on a desktop, if you look at it on mobile, the text that they had, I believe, was white, and it just happened because everything reshifts when you're on mobile. So then the text ended up a little bit of was over the image, and most of it was over the white background. So you couldn't read it because it's essentially white on white. And that kind of problem is like all over the web. So there's obviously ways to get around that. You could put like a transparent dark background behind the text in that instance if it's over a photo. But yeah, low contrast is the biggest issue that exists really on the web. Missing alternative text or images is another massive one. Almost like 60% of websites have that problem. Um, and there are kind of some of these things you can make judgment calls on how much detail you should put into these things, but all images should have an alt tag, even if it's empty. So if an image is supposed to convey content, you're basically supposed to put some alternative text in to describe what that content is. If it doesn't, if it's just there for being pretty, you don't necessarily have to, but you do have to stick an alt tag in. So just sticking an empty alt tag is better than not having anything at all. Empty links is a really common problem. So I'm just trying to think by that. We're not 100% sure what we're referring to actually by that, but I know that essentially links that don't have contextual content to where they're going is really problematic. So a lot of our clients, unfortunately, they'll end up editing content and they'll put things like click here links, or you have something like to find the latest information about something or other, you know, go here, and then the word here is linked. And a bit like I mentioned, if someone who's visually impaired browse a website might jump through the headings on a page to navigate, they'll jump through the links as well. So if you jump through the links and you can't make sense of them by themselves, it's not accessible, basically. And it's possible to code pages so links don't have descriptive text at all sometimes. Sometimes in the designs of pages, it might be an image or something else that's a bit more complicated. Missing form input labels, which is if you ever build a form, there has to be a textual label above the form element, and that has to be associated with the form field, of which is, it's HTML. It's not too tricky to actually achieve that. Things like empty buttons, which, yeah, sorry, I'm not sure exactly what we're referring to on that one either. And missing document language is simply a piece of HTML in the document that tells you this is English or this is French or this is German. And you can stick that in the HTML tag of a page, basically. It's fairly simple to do and very easily missed. I think we had websites in the past, sometimes it missed that, for example, picked up on errors and then we just fixed them. But checking the kind of top issues is sometimes a good thing to focus on. We also use tools like Lighthouse, you've probably heard of, which is a kind of performance best practice kind of accessibility testing tool. It's very simple though, so it gives you a very, very lightweight kind of overview of how performant a website is and things like accessibility. Gives you a nice little score out of 100, which can be quite nice. But it's something you can install in your browser and then just run on a website. It's quite a nice way just to kind of quickly run tests. The tool that I think we'd recommend, especially when you're starting out on accessibility, is this one. Cool. And I can share these links afterwards as well, obviously. But Accessibility Insights, which has been developed by Microsoft, is a really nice way to kind of test a website, and it gives you loads of information about it as well. And once you kind of put a website into the Accessibility Insight, you can do like a quick or fast pass test, I think they call it. It gives you a bunch of errors that come out, but it actually gives you guidance along the way. So it kind of takes you along the process. That's a lot easier to use than some of these tools that are super detailed. And as I said, there's a lot to accessibility. There's a lot of guidelines and it can be a bit overwhelming. So you're better off. I mean, we always believe you're better off if you care about it and you start somewhere, that's better than not doing it. So rather than try and be perfect, just try and focus on trying to make some improvements. That's more important, basically. I mean, when people come to us, obviously strive to make accessible websites, and we have an accessibility lead in the agency. It helps when we have to kind of work out complex problems. But ultimately, if a client wants to guarantee a site's accessible, you need to pay a proper company to do an audit who actually might use, get users to actually test it, and they can go through literally every single guideline. And that takes a lot of time and can be quite expensive. And yeah. And the only other thing I wanted to mention is, so the Web Accessibility Initiative website has a new training course, which they only launched a few months ago, actually. So for those that want to learn a bit more about accessibility, and it's supposed to be quite broad, it's not just technical. So it's kind of developed for people like across lots of different job roles, really. This is supposed to give quite a good overview. I've not been through it yet myself, but I did sign up to it recently because it looks quite interesting. But they launched it not so long ago, and it uses a website called edX. It's free, so you can buy a certificate, but you don't have to. But it's a nice way just to kind of get a good overview. And as I say, a lot of the people involved in the Web Accessibility Initiative are those that did the training videos on this. So that's probably quite a nice way to do a kind of guided learning thing. You could do it like, half a day, once a week, over a month or so. So it's not something you have to necessarily cram into a small amount of time. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of, and as I say, like retrofitting into an existing site, I think it's just taking it one step at a time, really, and just testing to see what things you can pick up and then trying to like make little improvements as you go. Sometimes if it's, I mean, we find it easier if we built the site ourselves, obviously, because we're familiar with the HTML and CSS. If it's something you've built yourself, you'll probably find it easier to fix your own code. If it's something that's from another system or a theme that someone's downloaded in WordPress or someone else built it, that might get problematic because it might get really complicated how to change things. But then you might need to think about longer term plans to do something a bit more comprehensive, possibly. But that depends really on the website you're looking at. Should I just carry on through the questions for now, Anne?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Another question was how far can you push a creative element of an accessible site? Things like text sizes are important. What's the best practice sizes? And given the wide number of devices accessing content, this can become a minefield. Do H sizes allow for accessibility? So I think design is essentially, it's like an artistic endeavor trying to, web design is making content easy for people to read fundamentally. You want to kind of get users to the site, hopefully get them to stay around for a bit, and make it easy for them to find the things or they want to read or do the things they need to do if it's a service or an e-commerce site. And all design has constraints like it does in the physical world, and you're building buildings or designing tables. So web design is no different really. We have like responsive web design these days with mobile and desktops. Accessibility is just another constraint really. So we don't see it as something that should constrain creativity. And I think HTML's got a lot better over the last, I guess, decade or so. As it's, you've got tags that describe things a lot more, like semantic HTML, things like the, header. And obviously headings have always been there in HTML, and there's lots of kind of semantic HTML you can use to structure your content. So it's, once you've done that, it becomes accessible by default almost. There are some tips on the WAI side again for designing for web accessibility. And that there was another resource that my accessibility lead mentioned not so long ago about design and accessibility, which I don't have on me, but if I can find it, I'll send it after this call. Because there's lots of people write about, like, if you're a designer, think about this for accessibility. If you're a project manager, think about that. Or it's not just about developers, like building the stuff. In reality, you have to think about accessibility throughout digital projects, really. Because although, like, the first question was about retrofitting, if you think about accessibility at the start, it's a lot easier to basically be successful with it. But there are some tips in here. And this is, it's not a huge article here, but it talks about contrast again, which I mentioned earlier. Things like not using color alone to convey information is quite important. And there'll probably be things about animation as well and auto playing things. I mean, we've had clients in the past where everyone, videos auto-playing as soon as you hit the homepage, and things like stuff that animates as soon as you hit a web page can be inaccessible, basically. And you need to try and have, and you definitely need to try and have controls on the designs to be able to control that stuff, to like stop it and start it and this kind of thing, which we've done for things like carousels and things like that in the past. Um, so I think as you get more comfortable with like what the constraints are in accessibility, it's probably a bit easier to think about how you can design for that, really. And by making stuff accessible, you're meaning that more people can see it as well. And whenever I talk to people about accessibility, it's not just about people who might be blind, it's about everyone, really. Because if you make it more accessible for, like, if you follow the accessibility guidelines, it becomes better for everyone, basically. And, as people get older, you have different accessibility needs. And, I can't read stuff as well as I used to be able to. And I like, I've been short-sighted forever, but now my, slightly harder to read stuff when it's very close up, as happens, obviously. Or I use mobile more, and if I'm on a busy train, I use a website completely differently. And I sometimes struggle to kind of press for links because I'm not big enough. So I did look at the like type sizes specifically because I was asked in the question. I'm pretty certain there isn't actually a kind of fixed requirement for exact sizes. I think I'd have to check with my accessibility lead again, but we always like try and recommend 16 point or equivalent as like the minimum size for text on a web page because it tends to be a bit more visible. But don't use fixed sizes to define it in CSS. You should use relative ones like rems, for example, because if you use fixed like pixels and things like this in CSS, it can stop people being able to resize content in a browser. So I mean, a bit going back to the previous question again, but other things you can do to kind of test a web page is if you just have your web page there and then you make it bigger, so like 200 or even 400%. And if you can, I mean, I'm hoping this one works because it's an accessibility website. But if you start, make it bigger and bigger and bigger, can you still use it? So a bad website, things will start to overlap. Navigation won't work because it may be one of the navigation things goes underneath something else. This is why things like pop-ups are a really bad idea generally, because they can cause havoc. And by making it bigger, you're probably just replicating what happens on mobile as well a little bit. But people with accessibility needs will often make a web page larger. Yeah, I think actually there you go. So that's 200%. I had to click quite a few times to get there. But 200% I think is AA. So that's usually the standard level for accessibility is the AA level. And your web page should work at 200%, which this one does happily. But it's a good one to test yourself. Tabbing through links as well is not a bad thing to do. I think on a Mac you have to do certain things to get that to work. I'm not sure if it is working just on Firefox. So you can see I'm tabbing through stuff here, and it should follow a logical order. It's basically. I mean, if for example complex forms are coded in a weird way, you'll see them jumping around all over the place, which obviously is really difficult to use. But yeah, but we recommend like 16 point equivalent font size as the smallest. Make sure you can zoom 200% and still use a web page. Don't use images as text. Occasionally that happens. Obviously, logos is the obvious example where you almost certainly have to, but normally you don't have to. And these days you can do really funky stuff with CSS. I mean, there's lots of clever stuff where you can like skew text and make it interesting, and 3D stuff even people play around with. Color contrast is probably the biggest problem. I mean, it's the number one problem on that WebAIM million report I mentioned a moment ago. And that's the one to think about with design, really. There are tools to help you test that. Don't know if I've got any of them in here. No, I didn't, did I? But these are some plugins that can help. But there are lots of color contrast tools out there. I mean, I'm pretty certain that like things like Figma and other kind of design tools will actually. Oh, wonderful. The website's down or something. Okay. Ignore that. Sorry. Yeah, lots of design tools do have tools to help you check for things like color contrast. They have a kind of mathematical formula they worked out that basically says this is accessible and this isn't. And the larger the text is, you can get away with less contrast because it's easier to read. And the smaller the text is, you need higher contrast because it's harder to read. Like the latest like WCAG 2.2, some of the other changes they introduced are kind of more user experience things, really. Things like having consistent navigation on a page. I mean, one of the WCAG 2.2 guidelines is making sure that if you have help on a web page, like a contact link or a help link, that's in a consistent location on every page, so you can easily find it. That's just good design, quite frankly. But I guess they must have put that in there because that doesn't always happen, and people get confused about stuff and they want to find out how to get in touch. So yeah, just having, consistent navigation is a good thing for design. Whenever you use media, trying to use alternative text like transcripts or alternative text, obviously for images wherever possible. But as far as the actual content goes, it's just making sure it's structured. So things like headings. So don't use just bold and italics. If it's a heading, use an actual heading tag and use them in the right order as well. Because if you don't, it messes up when people try to navigate through it. And if you need to make different headings, different sizes, just do that through CSS because it's completely possible to do that. And be careful about automatically playing stuff like video or carousels. And if you use them, just have controls so you can pause them or stop them or start them. The world is most people, user experience experts, think that carousels don't particularly work. Most user research shows people don't really engage with stuff. Clients love them though. And it's a way of getting more content onto pages. So yeah, we do use them, but we try and make sure there's controls in there so they're a bit more usable, or we don't autoplay, this kind of thing. Cool. So there's another question about plugins to help with accessibility and which ones to avoid. And there are a few things we use actually. So obviously there is tools such as this Accessibility Insights, which is, as I say, what our accessibility lead, Nikki, she recommends this for our developers when they first start using accessibility and trying to test for accessibility, because it's a nice kind of guides you through that process, which is really nice. So I don't know, presumably people probably use WordPress, we do. And this is a free accessibility QA assistant, which is awesome. And looks like they've enabled it on here. So it does this little blue bar on the bottom right, this little blue circle. If I click on that, what happens is it kind of picks up stuff about accessibility on the page. So it will tell you if you're not using headings or if you've got alt text that is not set at all. Obviously, it can't really tell if your alt text is right. Is it suitable for use on the page? You have to kind of judge that yourself. But can give you a page outline, which is super interesting actually, because that shows you the outline of the content structure, like the H1 and the H2s. And if you've misused these, that becomes really obvious here. So if you press that button and it doesn't make any sense, it probably won't make sense to someone browsing it. So I found that quite useful actually. But yeah, this is well, there you go. So that's jumping through the alt text here, telling us that it's good. I'm not sure how it judges it's good, but probably because it's got some content and it's not one word, it's a bit longer. Yeah, and then there's warnings and other things it tells you about. So if you do use WordPress, this tool only enables once you're logged into WordPress usually. So if you start editing pages, if you're logged into WordPress, it will show you on the front end as well. But we've started using it over the last 6 months. It's quite a nice tool. It just kind of reminds you basically. So that's kind of a nice thing. I think there's a bookmarklet, so I suspect it works without WordPress as well. If you just want to kind of, install it into your browser and then you can press a button and it just kind of runs on the page you're on. But that's completely free, which is nice. The Gaadys Awards awarded a prize to these people as well. So they're one of the people who won one of the 3 awards. And this is another accessibility checker. And we haven't used this one yet, but I thought I'd mention it because you asked about plugins and this one seems to be a very good one. This looks like it's a bit more kind of thorough and runs reports, which you can then look at. Some of our clients do like to subscribe to some kind of service that reports on accessibility. I'm trying to remember that we do some work with UK Parliament and there's a service they use. I think it's SiteMorse possibly. And these are commercial services and you'll pay however much a month and they'll basically scan your site and tell you errors with it. And part of that would be accessibility. So this is something similar. I think there is a free version that can be used, certainly for individual use. But once you start using it on businesses for our there you go, the Gaadys logo. But it's a nice tool if you need a bit more in detailed reporting. And sometimes it's, while, as I said earlier, the only way to guarantee accessibility is to get someone to audit it properly. That can cost thousands of pounds to do properly, like 4 or 5 grand plus, quite easily. And not everyone can do that all the time, obviously, or if you can do it once every so often, obviously. So it's nice sometimes to have these other tools just to kind of monitor stuff in the background. But as I said earlier, this will not check everything. It's not possible. So if any accessibility tool says it checks for everything, they're lying, basically. It's not possible. But it doesn't mean they're not useful. They're still useful to kind of, help.
So Bernie put a message in the chat box about Jetpack on WordPress.
Does Jetpack, so I don't use Jetpack because it has lots and lots of stuff it sends back and forth to WordPress. So we don't tend to use that of our client sites. Does that have an accessibility testing feature then in Jetpack?
I just wondered because I have full-blown Jetpack, and these things often have, a secret hidden, Jetpack button, and it was just in case you knew something. Oh yeah, and they do this, and
Yeah, we don't know exactly what it does. No, I know their scan tool is quite useful because it will basically detect security vulnerabilities in WordPress plugins.
Yeah,
and I think it's the only way to get a free version of that. Although they say it's paid actually now, so maybe it's not free.
there's a free version and a paid version, but
yeah,
you can. It's not good value for people listening back to go off into a Jetpack analysis, because nearly every WordPress conversation seems to involve that. So
yeah, so we don't use it as a matter of course at all.
Emily's Emily's just linked to accessibility feature on Jetpack in the chat, so we can have a look at that later, Bernie.
Okay, yeah, we can take a cool. Oh, so I see plugins that will help with it. Anyway, take a look at that later. That'd be interesting. Yeah, we try and keep our plugins in WordPress fairly limited, so it's not, because otherwise you just kind of overbloats things if we're not careful. Yeah, and we tend to use other tools for the accessibility side of things, really. So, sorry, is it Axon? So this is one of the browser testing tools we use. This is Axe, which I don't think I've got on here at the moment. So there's a couple of browser kind of testing tools you can run, which will essentially interrogate the page you're looking at and highlight loads of accessibility issues with it. So one of them we use is Axe Dev Tools. The other one is Wave Accessibility Tool. They get a bit more detailed and techy. So if you, as I say, the first step is that accessibility insights from Microsoft is probably a better tool to use. It kind of guides you a bit more, but Wave is really useful. Wave their own website. And you can see here it kind of comes up with a bunch of kind of errors and alerts and other things. Some of these things are things you're going to have to check manually. As I said earlier, not everything can be judged, but it's useful. And it's a bit more techy and detailed than the other plugin I mentioned earlier, kind of a Sally one. As you can see, it goes through lots of stuff. But the team does use this as a way to kind of like dig into things and check. Oh, this is the color contrast checker. I've had it loaded after all. And if you're checking contrast of colors, if you don't have a plugin in the actual design tool you're using, this is quite a good way to do it. As you can see, it has different, it judges depending on whether the text is large or normal sized, which is quite helpful. It has to be said, sometimes you get a few color combinations, but while they pass, they still look a bit funky. So sometimes you can use your own judgment as well. And obviously making it better contrast is usually better for people. AAA is going to be a higher contrast than AA, and sometimes AAA will make a lot more sense. So, but they're useful tools just to kind of quickly check, especially if you look at something and go, I don't think that's accessible. Because the way the web design works, it's not always possible for automated tools like Wave and Axe and other stuff like that to pick up on contrast problems, because it's like if you've got text over an image, it's quite difficult to judge exactly what color you're trying to test it against. And there's lots of ways of doing colors in CSS. But that's quite a useful tool. There's quite a lot of these things out there. As far as tools not to use, I mean, one of the things we personally recommend against is accessibility overlays, which people do use. And actually, I've got the article there, but we did write a piece on this earlier this year. Is anyone even aware of what accessibility overlays are?
No, I'm not.
No. So basically, there is a industry out there that creates, but you have a paid service that basically is supposed to automatically fix accessibility on top of your site. So it's as if you have a button that is pressed or something like this that basically, without you having to worry about it, makes a website accessible. And they can obviously help and they can fix some things. The trouble is they tend to get sites. It's like a JavaScript thing usually. I don't have a website with an example off the top of my head, but there's quite a few kind of large. Okay, oh, cool.
I can give you a second. One of mine, of course.
Lots of people use them. And a lot of people use them without realizing that they don't actually make a site completely accessible because, as I said earlier, like a testing tool can't test everything. That's a tool that would try and retrofit automatically. Accessibility is never going to work.
I put it on that website as a test to see how it worked. I find it's a little unstable too.
Yeah. I mean, there's a number, it's become a bit controversial in the accessibility industry. Oh, there you go. Because they can interfere with accessibility tools themselves. So, for example, if there's an accessibility overlay on a website, it's quite hard for us to test it because the testing tools we use tend to break because of the accessibility overlay. But also, they can break or can cause problems with especially like screen readers and browsers that people with like accessibility needs might use. So while it seems like a nice idea in principle, they can cause lots of problems. And as ever, people often market them as if they're a panacea and they kind of solve everything when they don't. And they're only like maybe a small part of a solution. So we generally recommend against them. As I say, we did write this article. I mean, the IAAP, which is an Association of Accessibility Professionals, did eventually, earlier this year, put a statement out saying they're not going to fix everything, basically, so don't think they will. And the IAAP actually is, you can do, sorry, that's the Gaadys Accessibility Day website. And the IAAP, is that them? Yeah. You can do accessibility certification through them as well. So that's something that some people like to do. If you get a bit deeper into accessibility stuff, and they do kind of high level initial certifications, and then there's deeper ones for certain types of like developers or some other kind of roles. And a lot of people do that as kind of just to further their career. But yeah, we'd recommend against accessibility overlays. And there's this lovely website that kind of overlay fact sheet that kind of talks about the strengths and weaknesses of them and why they can be problematic. Other questions? It's probably all the screens to share at the moment, unless we talk about amplifying stuff later. Sorry, how do I stop sharing? Apologies.
Okay.
There it is. Got it.
There you go.
Yeah, another question about how to manage client expectations. WCAG compliance sometimes impacts pre-existing branding and workflow. I mean, I think it's just telling people, like talking about it early on is the best thing to do. I mean, people almost always say that accessibility is important. It's often not in reality to them once you actually start a project. I mean, people have been talking about accessibility for decades, but it's only, in our experience, it's only recently, like the last, 3 or 4 years, that clients are actually really caring about it, which is lovely to see. Most of it's driven from a public sector law that went through a few years ago. So all government departments, public sector, universities, they're all basically getting audited now and have been as well by central government. So they kind of have to. So it's kind of, there are people who care about it and do the right thing. And then there's people who have been brought alongside because they know they have to do it, which is good. But with anyone, if you just talk about it earlier, I think it makes it easier. I mean, whenever we're not a branding agency. We don't kind of create logos and things from scratch for people. occasionally we have in the past, a long time ago, but we kind of will take people's brand and interpret it to use online. And it's all what you've always had to kind of change brand, because often stuff's designed for print that doesn't work on digital. Or as soon as it's made small, like a little postage stamp, you can't read it. Or the colors don't work because the contrast is a bit funky. Like gold, for example, looks lovely when you print it, but looks a bit, yellow's nice, but you can't really do gold on the web, really. So yeah, I think we've always had to change brand stuff for digital and make it work better. And sometimes that can be really successful. And we've had clients in the past where we do digital stuff and then they work it back into their marketing stuff, which is nice. But talking about it early is good. And if people don't really buy into it, it's kind of explaining why it's important. And like I think people say like 1 in 6 people in the world have got disabilities, and you have different needs as you get older. So it becomes a business problem at some point. Like an e-commerce website, for example, you're basically stopping people buying from your site if it's not accessible. And you can very easily make e-commerce sites not accessible. I mean, lots. And my last question was, from my perspective, in terms of what I do on the website, I'd say the key focus is on images and how to use image text options to optimize for accessibility. Yeah, I mean, images is a really big one. It's the one I probably was first aware of, it's fair to say. And it's essentially non-text content giving a textual equivalent, really. And I'm sure there's some interesting, somewhere on the WAI site, they've got this kind of flowchart or bunch of text to describe when you should use alt text in different scenarios, which can be quite useful. Because sometimes you start doing it, and it's, almost anything could be described as just decorative and then not needing alt text. But understanding when you do need it isn't always very easy. But we always try and add alt text wherever possible. Makes sense, obviously, but it's not.
So that's my question. But also what I'm most often wondering is like, how much detail do I go into? It's like 2 dogs, it's raining, it's like,
that's a brilliant
are there
question.
any guidelines on it? Because how much time do I spend on it? But, but make sure that it's sufficient for somebody to actually get what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's lots of, but that's kind of not, that's people have to use their judgment, essentially. There are a few resources which help with that. So there's something on the WAI site. I have seen other resources as well. I'll try and find the links and share them afterwards, after this call. As I say, there's a flow chart on the WAI site that kind of tries to steer you in that direction, basically. But if as you're looking at the page, if that image contributes to your understanding as a visual person, that makes sense to try and have alt text. If it's just a pretty thing that just makes it nice, like sometimes hero images on sites, or on the WAI site, it's got icons on the top, like a little book icon next to W3C and tools next to WAI. They don't necessarily bring in a thing, and I think they're probably SVGs, so I don't imagine they do have any alt text as such. So it's not always necessary, but and if you use a CMS like WordPress, it's making sure that people can easily add alt text into those things. I mean, lots of times you get like a media library, you'll have a default alt text for an image, which can be helpful, but sometimes the alt text in reality is different based on the content of the page sometimes. So, and that depends on whether the CMS supports being able to customize the alt text of the page. I mean, most do, I think. I'm pretty sure WordPress does, which makes that possible. Yeah. But you have to, there's only so much time, but it gets harder with complex things like charts and things like this. And you can make data tables accessible if you just kind of tag up the heading rows in a certain way. So as long as there's technical information on that as well online. And but like visual charts, they're like, we use a JavaScript tool called D3, which creates nice, pretty charts in various different formats. But that's all JavaScript, so it's not particularly accessible. So you either provide alternatives to that, or find ways of making that more accessible. It's sometimes it's challenging, and we're learning as well, to be honest with you, sometimes, or reading resources that people have shared.
Okay.
So yeah, any other questions at all, or things about any aspect of that really, or the Amplify project, or
Simon, if you've got I'm looking for something I can like shout at other people. Like, oh, did you know that 47% of the websites in the UK aren't accessible, or 18 trillion gazillion dollars are lost every hour because people don't, like.
Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of. There are a lot of those things around. Stats on why accessibility matters. I mean, I'm sure the WAIMA site must have that. I've put things into previous talks I've had.
I'm not going to like pin use my 2024 election campaign on it, but I just as a sort of anecdotal example.
Yeah, I think the well, I mean, there are laws obviously on the basic line, like the Equality Act and the public sector bodies accessibility regulations in the UK are the things that say that all public sector people have to be accessible.
I'm sure ChatGPT would kick out some of those for you, Bernie, in a matter of seconds. ChatGPT will kick those out for you.
I'm looking for the 8 out of 10 cats quote kind of thing,
Well, we've got the 1 in 6.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm aware, 1 in 6 people have disabilities. It's something I don't have the numbers in front of me because I don't have the notes for this talk thing I've got in front of me. But
Martin Sibley will have those, Bernie.
Yeah, I can. If there's any things I can find, I can send them across.
I can find it somewhere.
Yeah, there's lots of stats about that kind of stuff, and there'll be a page like the business case for accessibility, effectively, is what you're describing, and most of it's around. There's a very large number of people who it affects, and it's not just traditionally disabled people; it's lots of people. So,
okay, right. So, Simon, thank you again so much for your time and for sharing all that with us. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions come back to us when we share the recording. So we may come back to you and ask you for some more information sometime. But yeah, that was really, really great. Thank you.
Cool, pleasure. Awesome.
I think it's really great. And I could just say, I'm really thinking now about, having an accessibility update strategy, because we're a tiny company. So how I can allow budgeting for the next 12 months and then prioritizing and sequencing what we're doing first. First, of course, like going forward needs to be in line. And then how we start to retrofit this bit, and that bit. So I think it's really helpful to just get an understanding of how I can structure that strategy. So I can manage it, but I can also sequence it without kind of breaking my cash flow.
Good idea.